I take the two together, I have a net receivable of 6. And if the textbook author were to say that, I would reply, well, you're making life a little bit more complicated, but if you wish to do that, that's perfectly okay. So the bottom line is you could either debit receivable for the present value 6, or debit the receivable for the full value of 10, also called the future value, but then you need to book a contra receivable of -4 to get the overall increase in assets back down to 6. Revenue, however, which is the increase in the value of the company, is always 6. Okay. What happens? Well, for each year thereafter, until it's time to finally pay 10 5 years in the future, the present value is going to increase. In fact, it's increasing each year from its immediate present value of 6 up towards 10. So each year, as you recalculate the present value, because the present value of the asset is always going to be what the asset value is recorded at, the total assets are going to be increasing every year. And as assets increase, you're going to have an increase in the value of the firm, which will be revenue. In fact, the only possible answers here is increased total assets, record revenue, which is actually the right one, and decrease total assets and record expense. The two middle choices cannot possibly be true, because when you increase assets, the value of the company goes up. That's revenue, not expense. And when you decrease assets, the value of the company goes down, and that would be expense, not revenue. So it's either increase assets, create revenue, or decrease assets, create expense. And because the present value is increasing each year for those 5 years, it's the first answer. It's not the second answer. Okay, now we get into basically the vocabulary, if you will. What is the difference between a note receivable and an account receivable? A note is more formal. It is written. There's nothing that says it's only for tenants and landlords. Anyone who wants to formalize a receivable can ask for a note, and it certainly is not only for cryptocurrency. So the second choice is the right one. It's a little bit more formal. It is written, and it's usually what parties agree to create when the dollar amount is actually fairly high. Okay, next up. If I tell someone whom I owe money to, I promise you, as soon as I collect money from one customer, I will use that money to pay down what I owe you immediately. By definition, that is called an assignment of receivables. And there was one of our illustrations of the textbook focused on it. Now, we had a couple of textbooks illustrations, I believe, that dealt with factoring, one with recourse, one without recourse, but I didn't get into the recourse issue on this question. Basically, I just asked, what does factoring mean? Factoring, to factor a receivable, means I'm just selling it and I'm going to get cash for it. Someone is buying the receivable from me. That's different than an assignment. In an assignment, I'm not selling away the receivable. I still own the receivable. I'm still going to collect it myself. It's just that once I get the money, I'm going to turn over the money to some other party. Okay, that concludes our review of the quiz. Any questions? Okay, going once, going twice. And okay, great, great. Delighted. I think the most important concepts are the concepts in the first couple of questions. It's the way that long-term receivables work. If you can remember that, you record the asset at present value, not at the money, the future value, the money that you're eventually going to get. And as time passes, you recompute present value and adjust the receivable balance to the new present value. And that furthermore, every time you modify the asset value by any amount, because assets minus liabilities equals change in the value of the company, then as you are increasing the asset value, you are creating revenue. You are increasing the value of the company. If you got all those right, then that's great. Then you have fundamentally grasped the essential concept of the last lesson that we went through. Okay, so before I share screen again and we move on to the next topic, just have some odds and ends to announce. Number one, no class on Thursday next week. No, it's not a belated Valentine's Day celebration, although if you want to celebrate Valentine's Day belatedly on the 15th, you're perfectly certainly welcome to do so. Deloitte and the American Accounting Association have asked me to drive up to Dallas to do a presentation on some of my sustainability accounting work. Also doing some work in artificial intelligence and sustainability accounting. And so I need to be there on Thursday. And so no class for us on Thursday. That's not this Thursday. Okay, tomorrow is not Valentine's Day. This Thursday we are meeting. It's Thursday next week that we're not going to meet. Another announcement, to my distress, and this happens from time to time, some students have been using Canvas to send messages to me. And I have instructed Canvas to send messages from students directly to email, so I know that they want to contact me so that I can answer them promptly. And there were 2 or 3 students who sent me messages over the last couple of days through Canvas, and Canvas never notified me that the students sent the messages. And so I was delayed in responding to them. Please, 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 please. If you want to contact me, number one, I always answer same day or next day. And so if 2 days go by and you don't hear from me, for some reason I didn't receive the message from you, please resend. If 1 day goes by and you haven't heard from me, well, it's possible that I'm going to answer you later that day, so you might want to sit tight just a little bit more. Please don't use Canvas at all, because I really don't want you to use Canvas to send me a message. And if Canvas does not forward it to me, I don't want to be in a position with you where I don't even know that the message was sent to begin with. So please use email. Basically, please use Outlook or whatever app that you have that works with Outlook. And I have Apple Mail, for instance. Feel free to use an Outlook related app, but the inbox and the message center within Canvas is not reliable. Not reliable. Please keep that in mind. Other issues, I have decided to try something new. I'm trying to get more and more specific in helping you understand exactly what I'm going to put on the quiz. And so what I'm going to try this time around, at the end of every class session, I am going to open up the content notes and I will use yellow highlight to highlight the specific illustrations that will be covered on the next quiz. And so I'll begin by doing that at the end of this session, and I'll try to make a habit of it. So if you wake up the next day or the morning of a quiz, and if you say, I'm not quite sure I took accurate notes about what's on the quiz today, you'll be able to go into Canvas, look at the content notes, and see what I have highlighted in yellow. Will it work? Well, I don't think it can hurt, and we'll see if it proves to be helpful. Final comment, and that this is quite reasonable. I am beginning to get messages from students who say, it just feels like I should be preparing more. What more can I read? What more can I review? The first thing I would mention is the reason why it feels like you should be preparing more is because you're accustomed to taking normal tests where there is an awful lot of material on each test. Quizzes are not only inherently briefer, but we're taking a quiz every session, and it's only covering the material on the previous session. And the previous session is not a full 90 minutes because it includes some time that we dedicate to the quiz. And so, by definition, the amount of material on each quiz is actually not very large. And that's why it feels like you should be studying more as compared to your usual exams. If you're thinking, okay, Mike, but I review your notes, I review the illustrations that you went over, I still feel like I should be doing more. What more can I do? Well, keep in mind, the textbook has not only illustrations, but the textbook actually has the body, content, paragraphs, words. And the words explain the concepts, but the words, the body of the chapters of the textbook, actually explains the illustration as well. So if you read the chapters and pay particular attention to the areas of the chapters around the illustrations, that would be an additional thing that you could do that I think could be helpful. Finally, if you are getting questions wrong, more than you think you should, I'm happy to chat with you about it. And actually, that's the kind of question that you could ask me, because it's not the type of content question that you would forward to the student center, the tutoring center. But keep in mind, it's really, really, really important to think about why you are getting the questions wrong. I mean, on the one hand, if you say, I actually knew the right answer, but I out-thought myself and talked myself into changing my answer, and then I got it wrong, well, that's very different than thinking, I got the wrong answer because I just guessed because I had no idea what was going on. And so, and there are other answers, other reasons as well. But please do think about the reason why you got questions wrong. And if you do reach out to me, that probably will be the very first question that I ask you. And so it's just something to think about. Okay, so let me pause for a moment. Question about any of these topics? Going once, going twice. Up, Joanne, go right ahead.
When is our quiz?
I'm sorry?
When is our quiz?
So I'm having trouble hearing you. There's an echo effect.
Can you hear me?
Um, Somewhat, yeah, yeah,
I'm
somewhat.
just asking, when is my quiz?
When is
The quiz?
when is the quiz? Um,
Yes.
okay, so each quiz begins a couple minutes after the start of the session, at like 2 minutes after the hour. Most students, I actually open the doors, so to speak, at 1 minute before the hour. And so it's about 3 minutes for students to come in. Each quiz begins at 2 minutes after the hour. It's usually a 5 question quiz. And at roughly 13 minutes after the hour, I announce, 1 minute to go, please submit quiz answers. And usually each quiz covers the content from the previous class session. Okay, other questions? And going once, and going twice. Okay, so let me proceed to share screen. Okay, we're sharing screen once again. And if you open up, we did have a couple of final illustrations in receivable um, that we didn't cover the last time around. The only thing that was new about these two illustrations, and I'll simply mention it briefly, is sometimes when you sell a receivable to another party, you are so desperate for cash that you say to the other party, buy this receivable, whether it's a note receivable or an accounts receivable, buy it from me, and I will accept from you a very small amount of cash. In fact, I will accept probably less than what it's worth because I'm desperate for cash. That's a discount on the sale of the receivable. And so what tends to happen is the receivable, which is an asset, is getting sold. So you are crediting the receivable when you sell it. You're reducing or writing off the receivable because you're selling it. You are getting some cash for it. And so you're increasing cash by the amount of money that someone is paying you. But if the sales price of the receivable is very discounted, if you're giving up a very good receivable and you're accepting just a tiny amount of cash because you're desperate for cash, then the increase in cash, the debit to cash, is going to be very small. The decrease in receivables, the asset that you're selling, the credit to receivables is going to be really big. You're going to have a small increase in an asset and a really big decrease in an asset. The value of the firm is going to go down, and you will have to record an expense or a loss on the sale. And that's what 719 and 720 walk you through. And in the interest of time, and because it's just a relatively minor point, which I think is somewhat common sense, I won't go through the illustrations in detail. Let me just repeat. If you sell any asset, it doesn't have to be a note receivable. If you sell any asset at a discount, and a deep discount because you're desperate for cash, the value of the asset that you're selling goes down to zero. You get some cash, so the cash asset goes up. But if you're not getting much cash, if there's a deep discount, cash will only go up by a little bit. Well, if one asset, whatever you're selling, goes down by a lot, but a cash asset only goes up by a little bit, the value of the company is going to decline, and you're going to have to record an expense or a loss. And you see the loss in illustration 720. Okay, let me pause for a moment. Any questions about that?
So the journal entry for the loss would say loss on sale of receivable.
Yes. Or I could say receivable sales expense.
Okay, and that would balance out the
The
small
journal
amount of
entry
cash increase and the large amount of the
reduction.
receivable.
That's
Yeah,
right.
the reduction.
Right. The reduction in the asset, which you are completely getting rid of because you're selling it, is going to
Yeah,
be very large. Increase in cash is going to be very small. And so overall, the change in cash will be pretty negative, which means the value of the firm is going to decline significantly. You could call it a loss. You can call it an expense. Um, it is an expense though, based on putting it into the column on the far right of that chart, the data analytics chart.
yeah. All right. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So let me now focus on inventories. Now, there are basically three different parts to this chapter. And I know you say three different parts, but I only see a part A and a part B. Realistically, illustration 8-2 is a lot. And that's what we're going to focus on today. In addition, FIFO and LIFO, that's FIFO and LIFO, is a lot. And we'll probably focus on that Thursday this week. The other stuff, there's a couple other illustrations in part A, and there's a couple illustrations in part B. Not so important. We'll cover those on Tuesday next week. But remember, Thursday next week, we're not meeting. And so the quiz on that last collection of miscellaneous illustrations will be 2 weeks from today. But the bottom line is illustration 8-2, a lot. And in my opinion, the most complicated material of the course. FIFO, LIFO, a lot. Not as complicated, but still very important. And the other stuff, not that important, although we will cover it briefly. In fact, 8.2 is so important that I created, well, actually, I'm going to use a different document, this one, to explain it. Now, if you say, what is this? This is actually a blog post that I wrote a long time ago. And you would think it would be ancient history, but because I took the time to lay out the material that actually underlies illustration 8-2, people keep asking me for copies of it. And so I've learned to rely on it when teaching 8-2, this particular subject matter. If you're just curious about what I'm blogging about right now, if you go to michaelcreighton.com, I do blog on a weekly basis about different things that I'm working on. But this was a blog post from some time ago related to some work that I was doing in the oil industry. And I'm going to use this to explain illustration 8-2. Okay, so what is this all about? Now, this article is about oil, but to keep it even simpler, I want us to think about a simpler production process. And the simplest production process I can think about, the simplest company that's producing something, if you're running a pottery That's Pottery, a pottery studio. And I think we can all visualize it. Someone takes a lump of raw clay, they put it on top of a spindle that spins around. Actually, before they drop the raw clay on top of the spindle, they take a little tube of grease, grease up the spindle so that the raw clay does not stick. Then they put the raw clay on top of the spindle. The spindle starts to spin around. The person uses his or her hands to smooth the raw clay into a clay pot. It moves into shape. It's now a clay pot. You pull it off the spindle, you put it into a box. That's it. So if you think about it, what are the resources that you use to create clay pots in a pottery studio? Well, you need the raw clay. That's a good place to begin. You need someone to operate the spindle, which is labor, human labor. You need a tube of grease. You need the spindle, something that spins around. And then you need a box to put the finished clay pot in. And that's pretty much it. That's all the material that you need. Let me stop right here, because if someone's having, feeling challenged and visualizing what I just described, then the rest of what I'm about to talk about is going to be difficult. So does anyone have any questions about just very basically what I just described as a simple manufacturing process? Okay, so you would think if you look down at equation number 5, that the income statement, which is revenues minus expenses equals earnings or net income, would be simple. You just add up revenues, you just add up your expenses. Those are the last two columns on the right of your data analytics chart. And revenues minus expenses equals net income or earnings. Equation 5 says that, but equation 5 takes it a little bit further, makes life a little bit complicated. Equation 5 says, there are two different types of expenses. There are the expenses that you have to spend money on to produce the clay pot. And there are also different expenses that has nothing to do with producing the clay pot, but they're still legitimate business expenses. Okay. Why is it important to differentiate the two? Well, if you say, I'm having trouble making money and I can't raise my prices, so I cannot increase revenue, maybe I can reduce my expenses. The first thing organizations look for is, can I reduce my administrative expenses? Or can I reduce expenses that has nothing to do with producing my product? And the reason why they look to reduce administrative expenses first is because they say, if I start cutting corners and look to reduce the costs of producing the product, I might have quality problems. If I buy cheaper clay, then the finished clay pot may start to crack. Or if I'm Boeing, the airplane manufacturer, the pieces of the airplane might actually start to fly off the airplane in midair, which, as some of you probably know, is exactly what's happening to Boeing. And so there's a natural reluctance to reduce expenses because of profit concerns if the expenses are directly related to producing the product. There's a little bit more inclination to be willing to produce administrative expenses that have nothing to do with the production of your product. Okay, you may think, then what you see here in equation 5 called CGS, cost of goods sold, is the cost of producing the product. What you see here as GA, general and administrative expenses, nothing to do with producing the product. And it makes sense to differentiate between the two in our income statement. Okay. Why do we need the first 4 equations though? Why don't we just list costs of producing product expenses, administrative expenses, and just have a simple statement, income statement? It's for the following reason. When you are producing something, when you're manufacturing something, inventory, stuff that you have available as an asset, becomes relevant to your calculation of expenses. Why and how? Well, let's start with equation number 1. Okay, I'm manufacturing raw clay. There should be a question that I, as the pottery studio manager, should always be asking myself. Every day, I should be asking myself this question, and every day I should know the answer. How much raw clay do I intend to use to produce my product today? And why do I need to know that? Well, if I have no idea how much raw clay I need to produce today's clay pots, then I might run out of raw clay in the middle of the day. And if there's one thing you never want to run out of in the middle of the day when you're producing clay pots, it's raw clay. And so I better know, first and foremost, how much raw clay I will use in production today. Now you might say, yes, but there's this abbreviation, Mike, DM. Is that the raw clay? Yes, it is. DM means direct material. It's the primary material that you directly use to produce your finished good, your clay pot. And so if you're producing clay pots, the direct material, the material that you used that directly goes into the finished clay pot, is raw clay. Okay, well, how much raw clay, which is the direct material, do I expect to use today? If I start the day at 9 a.m., and if at the beginning of the day at 9 a.m., there is a little pile of direct material, of raw clay, that was left over from yesterday, I'm probably going to start the day by using it. So, direct material used to produce clay pots today. First and foremost is any raw clay that is sitting in my studio at the start of the day. I'm going to use that first. Plus P. What does P stands for? P stands for purchases of raw clay during the day. And by the way, guys, please keep in mind, like all documents, this is in Canvas. So if you want to download it and actually type notes or annotate directly into this document, that's why I'm giving you the document in this form. This document is in Canvas. All my documents are. And so P stands for purchases of raw clay during the day. Let's say you start the day at 9 a.m. You start using the raw clay, the little pile that was left over from yesterday. Raw clay at the start of the day. Well, 1 hour later at 10 a.m., a big truck from the clay pit comes rolling by and says, do you want to buy your daily allotment of raw clay? Well, yes, of course I will, because I'm only working down the little bit of raw clay that was here at the beginning of the day because I did not get to use it yesterday. The raw clay used in production today will be whatever was left over from yesterday and was here at the beginning of the day, plus P, the new larger pile of raw clay that I bought later this morning. Okay, is that equal to the total amount of raw clay used in production today? Not exactly, because let's say you quit at 5 p.m. At 5 p.m., you might say, wait a minute, I did not actually use all of the P, all of the raw clay that I purchased today. There's a little bit of raw clay that's still sitting there in my studio. I will not use it today. I'm saving it for tomorrow morning. That little bit of my purchase of raw clay today that I won't use until tomorrow is the raw clay or direct material that is still sitting in my studio unused at the end of the day. The bottom line is, and again, the equation number one, I'm hoping sounds logical to you. The amount of raw clay that I use in production today equals the amount of raw clay that was sitting there unused at the start of today, plus the new batch or the new shipment of raw clay that I purchased this morning, except for or minus the portion of the purchase that I didn't get around to using today. And so it's sitting in the corner at the end of the day. I'm not going to use it today. Presumably, I will use it tomorrow. Okay, that's my explanation of equation one. Any questions about the equation? Okay, next equation, equation two. Okay, it makes sense that of all the resources that you need to use to manufacture clay pots, you would start by saying, how much raw clay am I going to use today? I better have a handle on that. If I'm trying to make clay pots and I run out of clay, obviously I'm out of business. But there are other things that I need to produce clay pots, and I really have to keep track of all of them. I mean, if the turntable, the spindle, breaks down, then I can't produce. If the little tube of grease gets used up, then again, I can't produce clay pots. And if the human being, the laborer, says, I'm tired, I'm taking the day off, I'm sick, then once again, I cannot produce clay pots at all. And so equation two says, okay, the total amount of resources that you're going to use while producing your product today will be equal to the raw clay you intend to use today. Well, that number comes from equation one. That's the purpose of number one. Are you planning to use any more resources today? Well, yeah, I need the human being, to operate the turntable, the spindle, and to physically shape the product with his or her hands. Well, that human being as a resource is called direct labor. Direct labor, DL. Why? Because he or she is a laborer and he or she is directly using his or her hands to shape the finished product. he or she is directly on the assembly line and they're not administrators. They are directly shaping your product. Therefore, they are labeled direct labor. All of the other costs of production, which in our example is the tube of grease, the spindle, and the little box that you put the finished product in, that's called overhead, OH. And so if you say for equation 2, okay, raw clay is not the only resource I'm using today. What are my total amount of resources that I'm using today? It's the raw clay used. That's your direct material, plus the amount of human labor used to operate the spindle. That's direct labor. And then there's everything else, which is usually a laundry list of a lot of little things. Overhead. The sum of those 3 different types of resources used in production today is the total amount of resources used in production today. And that acronym stands for total manufacturing costs, which means total of all resources, the clay, the laborer, and the overhead, meaning everything else, used in the production process today. Question about equation 2. Okay. Next up, equation 3. And I think this might be the single most complex concept in the most conceptually complex lesson of the class. So hang on. If you're following so far, you're doing great. But hang on for equation 3. The problem with equation 2 is equation 2 just tells us how many resources we're using today. Equation 2 does not tell us whether anything is getting done. To give you an example, I'm sorry, question? Question? I don't think that's a question. I think that's just someone unmuted accidentally. So I'm going to go ahead and mute. Again, if someone does have a question, it's just easier to let me know that it's a question as opposed to an accidental unmuting by raising your electronic hand. I'm not too much of a stickler for ceremony. It's just that if you raise your electronic hand, I will know you have a question. And if you don't, then I'm never sure if you just accidentally unmuted. Okay, so equation 2 says this is the total amount of resources I am using today. Equation number 2 does not tell us whether or not we are actually getting anything done. If I have a day when I'm doing a lot of work, but nothing ever gets done, I might have a big number coming out of equation 2. Because if I'm doing a lot of work, then I'm using up a lot of resources. That doesn't mean I'm actually getting anything done. And so equation 3 answers the question, how many clay pots are you finishing today? Because that's the whole point. You're not just burning through clay and human labor and tubes of grease and keeping the spindle spinning. You want to finish, put into the box, get it ready to be sold. You want to finish clay pots. I actually do not like the acronym cost of goods manufactured. I would actually prefer the acronym cost of goods finished. Okay. Unfortunately, I'm not the king of accounting, so I cannot simply change that acronym. But the cost of goods manufactured, CGM, is really the cost of goods finished. Okay. So, how do you know how many goods, how many boxes of finished clay pots you will finish today? What's that number? How do you calculate it? Well, what will often happen is you will start a clay pot near the end of the day, like at 4:50 p.m. You start manufacturing a clay pot, but then 5 p.m. hits and a little alarm goes off and you say quitting time. You started the clay pot, you haven't finished it. Do you stick around and finish it before going home? Or do you say, it's 5 o'clock, I'll just leave this partially finished clay pot until tomorrow. And the first thing tomorrow morning, I'll come in and I'll finish it. Well, first of all, the acronym for partially finished clay pot left at the end of the day to be finished the next morning. That partially finished clay pot is called a work in process, WIP, work in process. Equation 3, how many clay pots do I expect to finish today? Well, if I come in at 9 a.m. and there is a partially finished clay pot, a work in process, that I began yesterday, the first thing I'm going to do is finish it today. And so any work in process, partially finished at the start of the day, will be something that right off the bat, I'm going to finish today. Then, okay, so that's this first expression. Then I'm going to start using or continue using all of the resources that I expect to utilize today. So where do I find the amount of resources that I'm utilizing today? Well, that was the whole point of equation number 2. However, at the end of today, I might say, uh-oh, I just started something, a clay pot, at 4:45. It's almost finished at 5 p.m., but not quite. As a result, at the end of today, I may have some work in process at the end of the day that I worked on today, but I won't finish until tomorrow morning. That would be work in process at the end of the day. So the cost of goods manufactured today. Now, again, just like the previous 2 equations, sit back a little bit, take a deep breath, and just think about this conceptually. If I want to compute the cost of clay pots that I finished today, that cost will be equal to the cost of partially completed clay pots that I began yesterday, but will finish today, plus all of the new work that I'm working on today for the first time, except for, or minus, the portion of the new work that I'm working on today for the first time that technically I won't quite complete or finish today. It'll be left over at the end of the day to be finished or completed tomorrow. That is the logic behind equation 3. Let's take a deep breath. Any questions about the logic behind equation 3? And let me also ask, does everyone notice how each new equation builds upon the previous one? That in equation 2, the first number comes from equation 1, and in equation 3, the second number comes from equation 2. Any questions about that? Okay, on to equation 4. Equation 4 says, it's great that we now know how many clay pots, or the value of the clay pots, that we will finish today. That's cost of goods manufactured. But remember, equation 4 says, we're not just trying to manufacture and finish clay pots, we actually want to sell them. And so the cost or the value of the clay pots that we expect to sell today, cost of goods sold, is equal to this expression. Well, how many clay pots are we going to sell today? When we begin the day at 9 a.m., there are going to be some clay pots, usually some product, that we finished yesterday, but we didn't sell yesterday. So they're still sitting on the shelf, ready to be sold this morning. This morning, when we come into work at 9 a.m., the finished clay pots in their little boxes, ready to be sold, that's finished goods at the start of the day, and we're going to sell them first. Then we're going to start selling all of the goods, the new goods that we are finishing today, which is cost of goods manufactured. Cost of goods manufactured is the value of the goods that we are finishing for the first time today. Okay, take half a step back. So the cost of all the goods that we're selling today equals the cost of the goods that we actually finished yesterday and that are sitting on our shelf at the beginning of today waiting to be sold. Plus, we're then going to start selling today all of the goods that we're finishing for sale today. But wait a minute. What if we finished a clay pot or two today? So they're in today's cost of goods manufactured, but no customer comes by to buy them today. And so we're going to have some finished goods, some finished clay pots that we did finish today, but they'll still be sitting on the shelf unsold at the end of today, and we'll probably sell them first thing tomorrow morning. Those would be finished goods in inventory at the end of the day. The logic for equation 4 is actually similar to the logic for equations 1 and 3, but they have to do with trying to figure out how many goods, what is the value of the goods, of the clay pots that you're actually planning to sell today. And it's equal to, so again, sit back a bit, deep breath, just listen to this conceptually. What I'm going to sell today is what I finished yesterday, and it's still waiting to be sold first thing this morning, start of the day. Plus, whatever I finished today, hoping to sell today, except for the portion that I finished today that I just didn't get around to selling today. And therefore, it sits in finished goods at the end of the day, waiting to be sold first thing tomorrow. That equals the cost of the goods that I expect to sell today. And that's the logic behind equation 4. So once again, deep breath. Any questions about the logic behind equation 4? Excellent. Okay. Well, equation 5 is everyone's favorite equation. Now that you know the cost or the expenses related to the products that you sell today, Well, the revenue is what you get from your customer when you sell them the clay pots today. So revenue from selling clay pots minus the expense of producing those clay pots. And again, that number comes from the previous equation. Each equation builds on the previous one. Revenue minus expenses or cost equals earnings or net income. The only additional term, GA, stands for general and administrative expenses. Sometimes you'll also see a letter S, which stands for sales or selling expenses. What are they? Well, a lot of times you have a salesperson, salesman or saleswoman, and the salesperson says, I can sell anything. I don't even care what I'm selling. I just look at the product, I notice something about it. I'm really good at sweet talking people, and they buy it, and I earn my sales commission. I've never even stepped foot in the factory, the play studio. Well, that would be a selling expense. That would be an S. That has nothing to do with the cost of manufacturing the product. So that would not be in CGS, cost of goods sold. You stick it in the S, the selling, sales commission, it would go into your general and administrative expenses. Another administrative expense that has nothing to do with the cost of producing your product, CGS, the cost of paying someone to do your accounting. A lot of accountants never, ever, ever step foot in the factory. A lot of accountants just say, email the information to me. I will update the general ledger. I will complete your tax returns. I don't really have to understand how you create clay pots. I don't have to see how it's done. And so an accounting fee is an administrative expense. It goes in GA, administrative expenses. It has nothing to do with producing the product. It is not in cost of goods sold. Okay, what's an example of a G? G stands for general expenses. These are the really, really, really extraneous expenses that are as far as possible from the cost of producing the product. My favorite example, let's say your pottery studio has a small front lawn, a little bit of grass, maybe a couple of shrubs in front of the building. Well, if you were to say, the grass looks kind of dry, the shrubs look kind of, well, let's just say you need to spiff up the front lawn a little bit. Plant a couple of flowers, maybe a new shrub or two, maybe even put down a sprinkler system. Now, you might say, does planting new grass in front of your pottery studio have anything to do with the cost of manufacturing and then selling clay pots? No. However, most people would say if you have an ugly front lawn in front of your building, it is a legitimate business expense to say, let's spiff it up a little bit. Let's pay a little bit of money. And so that would be a general expense. So these are either called GA, general and administrative expenses. I've also seen them called SGA, sales or selling, general and administrative expenses. If you go through this post, there's a different example that you see up here about oil and gas. But what we've used in discussing these 5 equations is a simpler example, pottery studio. And the conceptual meaning of each, or the conceptual purpose of each of the 5 equations is listed here. And so you can read through that too. I think it could be helpful. I'm going to stop here. As I mentioned, I am going to yellow highlight my reference to the other document, and then I'm going to go into the other document and yellow highlight the 5 equations because we discussed them. We also did discuss, simply put, the meaning or the purpose of each of the 5 equations. So I'm going to highlight the question, the conceptual definition of each of the 5 equations by doing this. And so immediately after concluding this class, I am going to go into our content notes. I am going to replace these 2 documents, which currently appear in content notes, with these new versions. The only difference between the old ones that I will delete and the new ones will be my yellow highlight. And so if you wake up on Thursday morning and say, what is it exactly that we reviewed? Oh yes, we reviewed this document, periodic inventory, and then within that document, the 5 equations and the meaning of each of the 5 equations. Again, not a big deal, but I'm hoping it helps you remember what we actually will put on each quiz. By the way, I just realized I'm giving you the word processing document here to make it easier for you to type directly into it to take notes. So the name of the document is DOCX. It's not a PDF document. So let me make that small correction. Okay, well, we actually finished at this point 7 minutes early, which I think is exactly what I would want to do. And it's not pushing up against 30 minutes after the hour, which I think we've done once or twice in the past. I hope that means that we're getting better at using our time wisely. But let me stop. Let me ask, does anyone have any questions about what we reviewed today, why it's meaningful, why accountants need to know what's going on here, how to compute these equations, and what specifically will be covered on the quiz on Thursday? Imran, go right ahead.
I know you briefly talked about 719 and 720 earlier. Is that going to be something that we have to study as well? Is that going to be tested on?
You know, because these 5 equations are relatively dense, let me simply say no. I did want to mention that to you, but I want to make sure that I'm always focusing and testing you on what I think is most important. This is far more important, and as a result, no, don't worry about that last comment about those last 2 illustrations. Good
Okay,
question.
thank you.
Sure, sure. Other questions? Alex, go right ahead.
With that being said about the 719, 720 for the 8.2 section, what kind of questions will you ask specifically regarding the equations?
Okay, for these 3 equations, I won't give you numerical questions, but I will ask you about the structure of these 5 equations, the way that you need the previous equation to get at least one number on the subsequent equation. I will ask you these expressions, to the right of the equal sign, which is basically what you are calculating. I will ask you why you're calculating it, with the y actually expressed or summarized here as well on the second page. So purely conceptual logic, that's what I'll be asking you on, asking you about. Now, after the quiz on Thursday, I will walk you through, a numerical example or two that is in the textbook, and then I'll move on to LIFO, FIFO, which is the other big concept of this particular chapter. But for this quiz coming up in 2 days, concepts only. Okay, other questions? Okay, then as always, I will hang out after class to answer individual questions. You're all welcome to hang out with us if you simply want to listen in. But let me officially say, this is the end of today's quiz. Hope you have a great, the end of today's lesson. The end of today's quiz happened some time ago. It's the end of the lesson. Have a great day today. I will hang out, but generally speaking, I will see you guys on Thursday.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good one.
It's my pleasure. You too. And Bob, go ahead.
So Professor, I submitted the quiz. When I look at the grades, it shows which questions I got wrong and which questions I got right, but the grade is not showing up.
Okay.
It's the grade is 0.
Um, I believe the most common reason for why this happens is when the student submits the quiz a little bit after I close the quiz. Okay, so when I said 1 minute to go, submit right now, did you wait a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, right. So that is usually what happens. Unfortunately, on the one hand, I can't give you direct credit for completing it if you did not submit it by the time that I closed the quiz, but do take, if you have a screenshot, do send it to me anyway. I will want to know, for myself that you did complete it, and I will take that into account if you seem to be on the margin at the end of the semester between 2 different grades. But that's something that it's a feature of Canvas, and it actually means that Canvas is operating correctly. The idea that if a student does not submit it by the time I close the quiz, then it will show up as a non-submission and an absence.
Okay. Thank you. I'll send you an email right after the quiz.
Sure, great. And I'm sorry that it worked out. I mean, remember, there will be 4 different quizzes that will not count towards your grade because I'm giving 24, but I'm only counting 20 quiz results. So this can be one of those 4. And again, it's to the extent that someone right on the margin, I do have flexibility in deciding whether or not, they get rounded up to the next grade. And it will be helpful to me to have that evidence that you can send me so that I can keep it in mind.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you, Professor.
Sure thing, Bob. No problem. No problem. Okay, other questions?